Somewhere in your refrigerator right now, there is a container of leftovers. Maybe it's rice from last night. Maybe it's a chicken breast you meal prepped on Sunday. And depending on how that food was cooked, cooled, stored, and reheated, it could either be perfectly fine, or it could make you seriously ill. Not because you did anything unusual, not because you're careless, but because almost nobody has ever sat down and explained, clearly and honestly, what actually happens to food the second time it's heated. I'm Dr. Marcus Reyes. I've spent years working in food safety and nutritional biochemistry, and if there's one thing that frustrates me about how this topic usually gets discussed online, it's this. It either gets ignored completely, or it gets exaggerated into pure fear, with vague claims about toxins and cancer that don't hold up when you actually look at the research. Neither approach helps you. Today, I want to do something different. I want to walk you through several foods that behave differently the second time they're heated. Rice, chicken, leafy greens, eggs, and a couple of others most videos never even mention. And for every single one, I'm going to tell you exactly what's genuinely well established, what's still uncertain, and what's simply a myth that refuses to die. Here's why this matters more than people think. Reheating leftovers isn't a rare behavior. It's one of the most common food habits on the planet. Billions of people do it every single day, in every country, in every kind of kitchen. And yet food safety education rarely goes beyond make sure it's hot. That advice isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. And the gap between what's actually known in food science and what the average household understands is enormous. I also want to say clearly, right at the start, what this video is not. This is not a video designed to make you afraid of your own refrigerator. It's not going to tell you that rice or chicken or spinach or eggs are dangerous foods you should avoid. They're not. Some of the healthiest, most affordable, most practical foods on Earth are on today's list. And that's exactly the point, because the risks we're talking about aren't about the food itself. They're about specific storage and reheating habits that are easy to fix once you understand them. If you've ever left rice on the counter overnight before putting it in the fridge, if you've ever microwaved chicken until the edges went rubbery, if you've ever reheated a big pot of spinach for the third night in a row, you are not alone, and you're not doing anything unusual. Millions of people do exactly this every week. What I want to give you today is not guilt, but clarity. The kind of clear, source-grounded understanding that lets you make small adjustments that genuinely reduce risk without turning grocery shopping or meal prep into a source of anxiety. One more thing before we get into the specifics. I'm going to be very deliberate about separating three categories of claims throughout this video. Things that are well established and backed by strong, repeated evidence. Things that are plausible and supported by some research but still genuinely uncertain, and things that are popular myths with little or no real evidence behind them. I think you deserve to know which is which, rather than having everything flattened into the same tone of alarm. That's rare in health content, and I think it matters. If any of this resonates with how you handle leftovers in your own kitchen, tell me in the comments. I read every one, and it genuinely shapes what I cover in future videos. And stay with me, because the food that surprises people most on this list isn't the one you'd expect, and the food that's actually the most dangerous isn't the one that gets the most attention online. I also want to acknowledge something up front, because I think it's easy to feel a little overwhelmed the moment a video starts talking about bacteria, toxins, and cancer research in the same breath. That reaction makes complete sense, and it's exactly why I want to slow down and be careful rather than rushing through a list of scary-sounding claims. Food is one of the most basic, constant parts of daily life. You make dozens of small decisions about it every single day, often without thinking about them at all, and that's normal, because you shouldn't have to treat every meal like a laboratory experiment. My goal isn't to change that. It's to hand you 2 or 3 specific pieces of information that fit naturally into habits you already have, so that the decisions you're already making automatically become a little safer without adding mental effort or anxiety to something that should stay simple. I want to mention one more thing before we dig into the specifics, because I think it changes how you'll hear everything that follows. Nutrition and food safety information usually reaches people in one of 2 forms. The first is the kind you get from a doctor during a rushed 15-minute appointment, where there's barely time to cover your actual medical concerns, let alone a detailed conversation about leftover storage. The second is the kind that circulates on social media, optimized far more for getting you to keep watching than for being accurate, which is exactly why so much of it swings toward exaggeration. Neither format is really built to give you calm, complete, well-sourced information about something as ordinary as reheating dinner. That's the gap I'm trying to fill today. Not by inventing drama, and not by pretending nothing here matters, but by walking through what's actually known, calmly and in enough detail that it sticks. Let's start with the one that has the strongest, most serious, most well-documented risk of everything we'll cover today. Rice is the most widely eaten staple food on the planet. More than 3 billion people depend on it as a primary calorie source, and in nearly every one of those households, leftover rice gets reheated on a regular basis. It's one of the most universal food habits that exists. And it's also the one place on today's list where the risk isn't subtle, isn't theoretical, and isn't something researchers are still debating. It's well established, well documented, and worth taking seriously. Here's the mechanism. Raw rice naturally carries spores of a bacterium called Bacillus cereus. This isn't contamination from poor handling. It's simply present on rice as it grows in the field, the same way many raw grains and vegetables carry naturally occurring bacteria. Cooking rice kills the active, vegetative form of the bacteria, but bacterial spores are built to survive exactly this kind of stress. Heat that kills the active bacteria often isn't enough to destroy the dormant spores. Once the rice is cooked, if it's left sitting out at room temperature, those surviving spores can germinate and multiply. Bacteria grow fastest in what food safety agencies call the temperature danger zone, roughly the range between refrigerator cold and hot holding temperatures, generally cited as being between about 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Sitting cooked rice out on the counter for a few hours while it cools, especially in a warm kitchen, gives Bacillus cereus exactly the environment it needs to multiply rapidly. As it multiplies, this bacterium produces a toxin called cerealide. And here is the single most important detail in this entire video. Cerealide is heat stable. That means when you later reheat the rice, even thoroughly, even until it's steaming, you will very likely kill the bacteria themselves, but you will not destroy the toxin they've already produced. The toxin survives the microwave. It survives the stovetop. It survives frying. It goes from the container straight into your digestive system, fully intact. This is well known enough in food safety circles that it has an informal nickname, fried rice syndrome. It typically causes vomiting that begins within 1 to 5 hours of eating, sometimes accompanied by stomach cramps and diarrhea. In most healthy adults, it resolves within a day, unpleasant but not dangerous, in rare, severe cases. And these are documented in medical literature, not hypothetical. Very high toxin exposure has been linked to liver failure, and there are a small number of case reports involving fatalities, most often connected to large batches of rice left unrefrigerated for extended periods, sometimes overnight. I want to be precise here, because this is not a cancer story, and I don't want to imply otherwise. This is a straightforward, well-documented foodborne illness story, and in some ways that makes it more important, not less, because foodborne illness happens on a much shorter timeline than the slow, cumulative processes involved in something like cancer risk. This can make you sick tonight, not over the next 20 years. So what should you actually do? The guidance here is simple and doesn't require any special equipment. Cook rice and get it out of the danger zone as quickly as you reasonably can, ideally cooling and refrigerating it within about an hour of cooking, not leaving it out on the counter while you finish the rest of dinner and clean up. Spreading rice out on a wide, shallow tray or plate, rather than leaving it in one deep pot, helps it cool faster, because heat escapes more quickly from a thin layer than from a dense mass. Once refrigerated, aim to eat it within 1 to 2 days. And when you reheat it, make sure it's heated evenly and thoroughly, steaming hot all the way through, not just warm in places with cold spots in the middle, which is a common problem with uneven microwave heating. One more practical point. Try not to reheat rice more than once. Each additional cycle of cooling and reheating is another opportunity for any surviving bacteria to multiply again before the next reheating kills them, and it doesn't reduce any toxin that's already been produced. If you're not going to finish a batch of rice within a couple of days, freezing it is a much safer option than repeatedly refrigerating and reheating small portions over many days. This isn't unique to rice, by the way. The same basic principle of cool quickly, refrigerate promptly, don't leave cooked starchy foods sitting at room temperature for hours applies to pasta and potatoes as well, which we'll come back to a little later, because there's a related risk with potatoes that almost nobody talks about. It's worth pausing on why rice specifically ends up at the center of this story more than other starches. Part of it is simply how commonly rice is cooked in bulk and stored for later, a habit that's efficient and practical, and one I'd never suggest giving up. Part of it is that rice is often served lukewarm rather than piping hot, especially in dishes like fried rice, which is precisely why the informal name fried rice syndrome stuck. Fried rice is frequently made from rice that was cooked earlier, cooled, and then quickly stir-fried, sometimes without reaching a high enough temperature throughout to guarantee it was heated thoroughly, and certainly without any process that could destroy a toxin that's already heat-stable to begin with. I also want to address portion size and restaurant versus home cooking, since this comes up often. Large batches. The kind you might see in a restaurant kitchen holding a big pot of rice on a warm counter for service, or a home cook making a large pot for a week of meals. Take longer to cool all the way through than a small portion, simply because there's more mass at the center that has to lose heat before it drops out of the danger zone. This is exactly why dividing rice into smaller, shallower containers before refrigerating isn't just a minor tip. It directly addresses the physics of why large batches are more prone to this problem in the first place. A rice cooker left on the warm setting for many hours can create a similar issue, since warm settings are often within or close to the danger zone range rather than solidly below it, and a stretch of many hours is more than enough time for a toxin-producing bacterium to establish itself if it wasn't cooled and refrigerated promptly to begin with. But for now, rice is genuinely the food on this list where the science is clearest and the stakes are highest. The good news is that the fix costs nothing and takes almost no extra effort. It's really just a matter of timing. And once you build the habit of getting rice into the fridge within about an hour of cooking, it becomes automatic rather than something you have to consciously think about every time. Now let's move to a food that gets talked about constantly in cancer research, but where the story is often told in a misleading way: chicken. Chicken is the default healthy protein in most households. Doctors recommend it. Dietitians build meal plans around it. Bodybuilders live on it. And for good reason. It's a lean, versatile, affordable source of complete protein. Nothing about today's discussion changes that basic nutritional picture. What does need clarifying is a genuine area of cancer research that often gets attached to chicken in health content. Heterocyclic amines, usually abbreviated as HCAs. These are real, well-studied compounds, and I don't want to downplay that. When meat, including chicken, beef, pork, and fish, is cooked at high, direct temperatures, especially grilling, pan-searing at high heat, or broiling to the point of visible browning or charring, creatine, amino acids, and sugars naturally present in the muscle tissue react and form these compounds. Some population studies have found associations between very frequent consumption of well-done, heavily browned, or charred meat and increased risk of certain cancers, particularly colorectal cancer. This is a legitimate, ongoing area of nutritional epidemiology. Here's where I want to correct something that a lot of health content gets wrong, sometimes deliberately for dramatic effect. The bulk of HCA formation happens during that first cooking process, specifically at high, direct heat with browning or charring, not primarily from gently reheating already cooked chicken in a microwave or oven. If you grill a chicken breast at a moderate temperature until it's just cooked through without heavy charring and then later reheat it gently, you are not creating anything close to the same HCA exposure as if you'd charred it black in the first place. The cooking method used the first time matters far more than the act of reheating. That said, reheating isn't entirely risk-free from a chemistry standpoint. It's just a smaller factor, and the mechanism is somewhat different. When cooked meat is refrigerated and then reheated, particularly at high power in a microwave, the fats in the meat can undergo additional oxidation. This produces compounds like malondialdehyde, which are markers of oxidative stress. The scientific evidence connecting this specific reheating-related oxidation to meaningful additional cancer risk in humans is considerably less robust than the evidence around HCA formation from direct high-heat cooking. It's a plausible contributing factor, not a well-established independent risk on its own. So what's the practical takeaway? It isn't never reheat chicken. That would be an overcorrection not supported by the evidence. The more accurate guidance is twofold. First, Pay more attention to how you cook chicken the first time, avoid heavy charring, and if you enjoy grilling, trimming visible char, and using moderate rather than extreme heat reduces HCA formation meaningfully. Second, when you do reheat leftover chicken, gentler heat is preferable to blasting it on high power in a microwave until it's tough and dry. Not primarily because of a large cancer risk difference, but because gentler reheating also preserves texture and reduces the kind of aggressive fat oxidation that, while not conclusively linked to cancer at typical exposure levels, is still worth minimizing where it's easy to do so. I also want to mention something practical that often gets lost in these discussions: reheating chicken thoroughly to a safe internal temperature. Generally cited as 165 degrees Fahrenheit, matters enormously for basic food safety, preventing bacterial illness from pathogens like Salmonella or Campylobacter that can be present on raw or undercooked poultry. That's actually a bigger, more immediate risk in most households than the oxidation chemistry we've just discussed, and it's worth not losing sight of it while focused on longer-term concerns. If this is useful to you, this is a good moment to hit like and share it with someone who meal preps chicken every single week, because getting this nuance right, cook it well the first time, reheat it gently, always heat it thoroughly, is exactly the kind of small adjustment that adds up. Now let's move to a food that's usually framed as the safest, healthiest thing on your plate, and where the real story is more interesting and more limited in who it actually applies to than most people realize. Spinach, Swiss chard, beet greens, and celery are consistently recommended by nutritionists, cardiologists, and oncologists, and that recommendation is well earned. These vegetables are rich in iron, folate, magnesium, and a range of antioxidants, and eating more of them is genuinely good advice for almost everyone. These vegetables also happen to be among the richest natural dietary sources of nitrates. It's important to understand that nitrates themselves are not inherently dangerous. In fact, your body converts some dietary nitrate into nitric oxide, a molecule that helps blood vessels relax and may support healthy blood pressure. This is actually one of the reasons beet juice, high in nitrates, has been studied for cardiovascular and exercise performance benefits. The concern arises through a specific chemical pathway. Once cooked leafy, greens are stored, naturally occurring bacteria on the surface of the leaves and in the environment can convert some of those nitrates into nitrites. This is the same basic chemical conversion involved in the curing of processed meats, and it's part of why the World Health Organization classified processed meat as a Group 1 carcinogen back in 2015, because nitrites in that context can react with amino acids under certain conditions, including heat and the acidic environment of the stomach, to form nitrosamines, compounds with genuine, well-documented carcinogenic potential in animal studies and some human epidemiological research. Here's where I want to give you the honest, complete picture rather than a partial one designed to alarm you. The strongest, clearest, most widely cited real-world guidance on this exact issue: cooked leafy greens, nitrate to nitrite conversion, storage, and reheating, comes from pediatric health authorities, and it's specifically about infant feeding. Health agencies in multiple countries advise against preparing large batches of pureed spinach, beets, or similar vegetables for babies and storing them for later use, precisely because infants are far more vulnerable to nitrite exposure than older children or adults. Their digestive systems and hemoglobin structure make them meaningfully more susceptible to a condition called methemoglobinemia, sometimes referred to as blue baby syndrome, which is directly connected to nitrite exposure. For most healthy adults, the evidence connecting occasional reheating of leftover cooked spinach to meaningful additional cancer risk is considerably weaker and less direct than either the rice story or the processed meat story. It's a real chemical pathway. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but the practical magnitude of risk at typical adult consumption patterns, eating a bowl of reheated sautéed spinach once or twice a week, is modest. And framing it with the same urgency as, say, daily processed meat consumption would be overstating the evidence. That said, there's no real cost to a few simple habits, even if you're not preparing food for an infant. If you're cooking a big batch of greens, you can cook only what you'll eat within a shorter window, store leftovers for a shorter period rather than a full week, and consider eating leftover greens cold in a salad rather than always reheating them, simply because it sidesteps the question entirely. None of this requires giving up spinach, chard, or beets. Foods that remain excellent, nutrient-dense choices, and cutting them out of fear would very likely do more harm to your overall diet quality than the marginal risk we're discussing here. Now, the next food is the one that tends to surprise people most because it's the one most consistently described as one of the healthiest, simplest foods available. And in some ways, it still is. But there's a genuinely interesting, still developing area of research worth understanding. Eggs are nutritionally excellent by almost any standard. They contain all 9 essential amino acids in a well-balanced ratio, making them a complete protein source. They provide choline, a nutrient essential for brain and liver function that many people don't get enough of. They're a good source of selenium, an important mineral involved in antioxidant defense, and they contain lutein and zeaxanthin, 2 antioxidants specifically associated with eye health. Nothing in this section is meant to suggest eggs are unhealthy. Quite the opposite. What's worth understanding is a specific, more recent area of research involving something called oxysterols, oxidized derivatives of cholesterol. Egg yolks contain both cholesterol and fat, and when cholesterol-containing foods are heated, cooled, and then heated again, laboratory research has documented the formation of these oxidized compounds. Some in vitro and animal studies have found that certain oxysterols can promote inflammation and, at high concentrations, damage cells in laboratory settings. I want to be careful and precise here, because this is exactly the kind of finding that's easy to overstate in health content. Laboratory and animal studies showing that isolated oxysterols can have inflammatory or cell-damaging effects at controlled, often high, concentrations are not the same as demonstrating that eating a portion of reheated, scrambled eggs meaningfully increases human cancer risk. The research on dietary oxysterols and real-world human health outcomes at the exposure levels typical of home cooking remains genuinely unsettled. It's an active, legitimate area of nutritional biochemistry research, but it would be inaccurate to present it as a settled cancer risk equivalent to something like the rice toxin story, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I implied otherwise, just to make this section feel more dramatic. Given that uncertainty, here's a reasonable, low-effort approach. If you're preparing eggs in advance, hard-boiled eggs stored, unpeeled in their shells, and eaten cold tend to hold up well, both in terms of texture and in avoiding repeated heating cycles altogether. If you do want to reheat egg dishes like scrambled eggs or frittata, gentler heat, a low oven, a covered pan on low, or a brief reheat rather than blasting it in a microwave until rubbery, is a reasonable, no-downside precaution, even while the underlying research on oxysterols continues to develop. This is a case where the honest answer is, there's an interesting signal worth knowing about, a sensible low-cost precaution you can take, but not a reason to change how often you eat eggs. Now, before we get to a summary, I want to cover 2 more things almost no video like this ever mentions. One because it's a real and underappreciated risk, and one because it's a widespread myth that deserves to be corrected rather than repeated. Let's start with potatoes, because there's a genuine, if lesser known, risk here that deserves more attention than it gets. Baked potatoes, especially when wrapped in aluminum foil, create a very specific problem when left at room temperature. The foil creates a low oxygen environment around the potato's surface, and that environment is exactly what a bacterium called Clostridium botulinum needs to grow and potentially produce botulinum toxin. The toxin responsible for botulism, a rare but extremely serious form of food poisoning that can cause paralysis and, in severe cases, be life-threatening. This isn't a common, everyday occurrence, and I don't want to overstate how frequently it happens. Significant botulism outbreaks linked to improperly stored baked potatoes are rare, but they are documented in public health records, and they illustrate a genuinely important principle. Foil-wrapped baked potatoes should either be eaten promptly after cooking or refrigerated promptly, not left wrapped in foil at room temperature for an extended period, because the very environment that makes them convenient to store is the same environment that, under specific conditions, can support toxin-producing bacteria. Once refrigerated properly and reheated to a safe temperature, this risk is effectively eliminated. The issue is specifically about extended, foil-wrapped, room temperature storage. Now, the mushroom myth. You may have heard some version of the claim that reheating cooked mushrooms is dangerous, sometimes described in dramatic terms online. This is one of those pieces of kitchen folklore that circulates widely with very little actual scientific support behind it. There's no strong, well-documented evidence that properly stored and reheated cooked mushrooms pose any special cancer or toxicity risk beyond the same basic food safety principles that apply to any leftover food. Cool them promptly, refrigerate them, reheat them thoroughly, and don't leave them sitting out for extended periods. If you've heard this claim and it's made you cautious about mushrooms specifically, you can set that particular worry aside. The standard leftover handling advice that applies to most cooked food is sufficient here, without any additional mushroom-specific concern. I include both of these because I think it's just as important to correct an overstated myth as it is to explain a genuine risk, and a lot of health content online only ever does one of those two things. Most videos on this topic stop at 4 or 5 foods, but 2 more categories come up constantly in real kitchens, and they deserve a mention, because the guidance for each is a little different from what we've covered so far. Start with soups, stews, and sauces. The big batch cooking that a lot of people rely on for weekday meals. These are actually some of the lower risk foods to reheat for a fairly intuitive reason. They're liquid-based, they tend to be stored and reheated at higher overall volume and moisture, and they reheat more evenly than a solid piece of meat or a scoop of rice, which reduces the chance of cold spots where bacteria can survive. The main food safety principle here is the same one we've mentioned already. Cool a large pot down reasonably quickly rather than putting a full, still hot stock pot directly into a packed refrigerator, where it can raise the temperature of everything around it and cool too slowly itself. Splitting a big batch into smaller, shallower containers before refrigerating helps it cool faster and more evenly, which is a simple habit that meaningfully reduces the time any food spends in that bacteria-friendly temperature range. One specific caution within this category: cream-based sauces and dishes with dairy reheat less predictably than broth-based ones, both in terms of texture. They can separate or curdle, and in terms of how evenly heat distributes through them. This is more of a quality issue than a safety issue in most cases, but it's worth reheating these gently, stirring frequently, rather than trying to blast them on high heat in one go. Seafood is a slightly different story. Fish and shellfish are more delicate proteins than chicken or beef, and they spoil faster, even under refrigeration, which is why food safety guidance generally recommends eating cooked seafood within a shorter window than other proteins, typically within a day or 2 rather than 3 to 4 days. The oxidation chemistry we discussed with chicken applies here too, and in some ways more so, because the fats in fish, particularly oily fish like salmon, are more prone to oxidation than the fats in poultry. This is mostly a flavor and quality concern. Oxidized fish fat is what produces that distinct fishy smell that gets stronger with each reheating. But it's also a reasonable additional reason to eat leftover seafood sooner rather than later, and to reheat it gently rather than at high, prolonged heat, which tends to dry it out and intensify that oxidized smell and taste. None of this is meant to add new foods to worry about. It's meant to fill in the picture. Liquid-based dishes are generally more forgiving to reheat than solid proteins or starches, and seafood is the one category where eat it sooner matters more than with almost anything else on today's list. Before we wrap up, I want to address a handful of questions that come up constantly whenever this topic gets discussed, because a lot of confusion isn't about the 4 or 6 foods themselves. It's about the mechanics of storing and reheating in general. Does freezing solve all of this? Freezing is genuinely one of the most effective tools available, and it doesn't get mentioned nearly enough in this conversation. Freezing doesn't kill bacteria or destroy toxins that have already formed, but it does stop bacterial growth almost entirely, which means it prevents the Bacillus cereus scenario with rice from developing in the first place, as long as the rice was frozen reasonably soon after cooking rather than after sitting out for hours. If you know you won't eat leftovers within a day or 2, freezing them promptly is usually a better choice than repeatedly refrigerating and reheating the same container over the course of a week. Does the container matter? Glass versus plastic? From a bacterial safety standpoint, no, not meaningfully. What matters far more is how quickly the food cools and how consistently it's kept cold, not the material of the container. There are separate, unrelated conversations about certain plastics and chemical leaching under high heat, which is a different topic from what we've covered today, but it's not part of the reheating and cancer discussion we've been having. Is the microwave worse than the stovetop or oven? Not inherently. The concern with microwaves isn't the technology itself, it's that microwaves heat unevenly, creating hot spots and cold spots within the same dish. That uneven heating is what allows some bacteria to survive in the cooler areas, even when the dish feels hot overall. Stirring food partway through microwaving, letting it sit for a minute afterwards so the heat equalizes, and checking that it's steaming hot throughout, not just on the surface, solves most of this problem without needing to switch to a different appliance entirely. How many times can you actually reheat something? The general, conservative guidance from most food safety agencies is to reheat leftovers only once. This isn't because a second or third reheating is instantly dangerous, but because each cycle of cooling and reheating is another window of time in the temperature danger zone, and those windows add up. If you've cooked a large batch, it's more efficient from a food safety standpoint to divide it into individual portions before refrigerating, so you're only reheating exactly what you'll eat each time, rather than repeatedly reheating and recooling one large container. Does smell or taste reliably tell you if something's gone bad? Not always, and this is an important point. Some of the risks we've discussed today, particularly the Bacillus cereus toxin in rice, don't necessarily produce an obvious off smell or off taste. Food can look, smell, and taste completely normal and still carry a toxin at a level that can make you sick. This is exactly why timing-based habits, how long something sat out, how long it's been refrigerated, matter more than relying on your senses alone, especially with rice and similar starchy foods. Before we get to the summary, I want to spend a moment on something that isn't strictly about food chemistry, but that I think matters just as much. Why does a gap this wide exist between what food safety research has established and what the average household actually knows? Part of it is simply that food safety guidance tends to live in places most people never encounter. Government agency websites, food science, textbooks, public health bulletins aimed at restaurants and institutional kitchens. It's not that this information is secret. The rice and Bacillus cereus story, for example, has been documented in food microbiology literature for decades, and it appears in official food safety guidance in multiple countries. It's just rarely translated into the kind of plain language explanation that actually reaches someone standing in their kitchen deciding whether to reheat last night's fried rice. Part of it, honestly, is that health content online tends to pull toward one of two extremes, and neither extreme serves you well. One extreme is silence. Nobody mentions it at all, because it isn't dramatic enough, or because reheat your rice properly doesn't generate the same attention as a bold, frightening claim. The other extreme is exaggeration, taking a real, narrow finding, like a laboratory study on oxysterols or a population study on well-done meat, and stretching it into a sweeping claim that a food you eat every day is quietly poisoning you. Both extremes fail you, just in different directions. Silence leaves you without practical information you could actually use. Exaggeration gives you fear without proportion, and fear without proportion tends to produce either anxiety or, just as often, a kind of fatigue where people stop believing any of it and tune all of it out, including the parts that are genuinely well established and worth acting on. I think the honest, useful place to sit is in the middle, acknowledging that yes, there are real mechanisms here, real chemistry, real documented risks in some cases, while also being upfront that some of what circulates as viral health content wildly overstates the strength of the evidence, sometimes to the point of describing normal, safe cooking behavior as if it were nearly as dangerous as smoking. Neither the food industry, marketing, everything is perfectly safe, nor the algorithm rewarding maximum fear are reliable guides here. The actual research, read carefully and reported honestly, usually lands somewhere calmer and more specific than either extreme. Think about who this gap actually affects. It's the parent making a big batch of rice for the week and leaving it out on the counter while dinner winds down and dishes get done. It's the college student living on meal-prepped chicken and rice, reheating the same container in a dorm microwave for the third day in a row. It's the person eating leftover spinach out of habit because throwing away food feels wasteful, not because anyone ever explained a shorter storage window would be a reasonable middle ground. None of these people are doing anything careless. They're doing exactly what nearly everyone does, because nobody ever laid out the specific, practical reasoning behind a slightly different approach. That's really the purpose of a video like this one. Not to hand you a list of foods to fear, and not to pretend every risk discussed online is imaginary either, but to give you the actual reasoning. the mechanism, the evidence, the honest confidence level behind each claim, so you can make small, informed adjustments without needing to overhaul how you eat. So let's step back and look at the complete, honest picture, because I think the value of this video is in the nuance, not in a single dramatic headline. Rice carries a genuinely well-documented, serious risk tied to a heat-stable bacterial toxin that survives reheating. This is the one place where the evidence is strongest and the practical fix, quick cooling and prompt refrigeration, matters most. Chicken carries a real, well-studied cancer research compound, heterocyclic amines, but the primary driver is how the meat is cooked the first time. High heat and charring, rather than the act of reheating itself, which plays a smaller, secondary role. Leafy greens carry a real chemical pathway involving nitrate to nitrite to nitrosamine conversion, but the clearest, best established real-world guidance on this exact issue is specifically about infant feeding, not general adult cancer risk, where the evidence is considerably weaker. Eggs are connected to a genuinely interesting, still developing area of research on oxysterols, but the human health significance at typical home cooking exposure levels remains unsettled, not established. Potatoes carry a real, if uncommon, risk specifically tied to foil-wrapped, room temperature storage connected to botulism rather than cancer. And mushrooms carry essentially no special reheating risk beyond ordinary food safety. The common claim about them is largely a myth. That's 6 foods, 6 different stories, and 6 different levels of evidence. And I think that honesty matters more than a single dramatic conclusion would. Some of this should genuinely change what you do tonight, particularly around rice and around foil-wrapped potatoes. Some of it is useful context that helps you cook a little smarter without requiring any real behavior change, particularly around chicken and greens. And some of it is simply interesting, evolving science worth knowing about without needing to act on it dramatically, particularly around eggs. If I had to rank today's topics by how confident the underlying science actually is, it would look something like this. At the top, the most solid and least disputed, the rice toxin mechanism and the foil-wrapped potato botulism risk, both of which are grounded in well-documented microbiology with clear, well-understood mechanisms and real recorded cases behind them. In the middle, the HCA in chicken research, which is genuinely well studied, but where the primary driver is the initial cooking method rather than reheating specifically, and the nitrate-nitrite-nitrosamine pathway in greens, which is chemically well understood, but where the clearest real-world application is pediatric rather than general adult risk. Near the bottom, in terms of current certainty, though still a legitimate area of ongoing research, the oxysterol and egg question, which is genuinely interesting but far from settled at the level of everyday human exposure. And separately, essentially unsupported, the mushroom reheating myth, which doesn't hold up as a distinct risk at all beyond standard food safety basics. I think laying it out this way, ranked by confidence rather than by drama, is more useful to you than treating every claim as equally certain, because that's not an honest reflection of where the science actually stands, and it lets you decide for yourself where to put your attention and effort. None of this should make you afraid of rice, chicken, spinach, eggs, potatoes, or mushrooms, all of which remain genuinely excellent foods and staples of a healthy diet. The goal was never to create fear about your kitchen. It was to replace vague, either ignored or exaggerated advice with something closer to the actual state of the evidence. I'll leave you with a few practical habits that cover nearly everything we discussed today, and none of them require special equipment or a significant change to how you cook. Cool cooked rice and potatoes quickly, and refrigerate them within about an hour rather than leaving them out while you finish dinner and clean the kitchen. If you're cooking a large batch, split it into smaller, shallow containers before refrigerating rather than one large deep pot, since that alone meaningfully speeds up cooling. Try to eat refrigerated rice within a day or two, and if you won't get to it in that window, freeze it instead of letting it sit in the fridge for most of a week. Avoid heavy charring when you cook meat at high heat, whether that's chicken, beef, or fish. And when you do reheat leftovers, gentler heat, a covered pan on low or a moderate oven. Beats blasting them on high in the microwave, both for texture and for minimizing additional fat oxidation. Always make sure reheated meat and poultry reach a safe internal temperature throughout, not just warm on the outside. Don't store large batches of pureed leafy greens specifically for infants. That's the one place the nitrate-nitrite research translates into clear, actionable guidance. If you're an adult eating greens yourself, a shorter storage window, a day or two rather than a full week, is a reasonable, low-effort habit, and eating leftover cooked greens cold in a salad is a simple way to sidestep the question of reheating altogether if you'd rather not think about it at all. If you reheat eggs, use gentler heat where you can, and consider keeping hard-boiled eggs unpeeled in the fridge and eating them cold rather than reheating them, which sidesteps the oxysterol question with essentially no downside. And if you wrap a potato in foil, either eat it soon after cooking or get it into the refrigerator promptly rather than leaving it out on the counter or in a warm oven for hours. The foil itself is the part of the equation that turns an otherwise low-risk food into one worth a little extra care. Finally, a habit that applies to nearly everything on this list at once. Plan portions so you generate fewer leftovers that sit around for days at a time in the first place. It's not a dramatic change, but of everything discussed today, it's probably the single adjustment that reduces the most risk across the widest range of foods, simply because less time in storage means less opportunity for any of these processes, bacterial, chemical, or otherwise, to happen at all. If you want more videos like this, ones that actually separate what's well established from what's still uncertain from what's simply a myth, subscribe and consider sharing this with someone who reheats their meal prep containers every day without giving it much thought. They deserve the complete, honest version of this story, not the version designed purely to keep them watching. Let me know in the comments which of these surprised you most. I'd guess it's either the rice toxin or the foil-wrapped potato risk, since those are the two that almost never get discussed, even though they're the most solidly documented. And if there's a specific food you'd like me to look into for a future video, tell me that too.